Welcome back to our fourth lesson of learning to read Biblical Hebrew. My name is Helmut Meijer, I'm your host, and I'm also your fellow scholar. For now, I'm just excited to share what I've learned over the past 14 years, and we are busy with not only the Hebrew alphabet, but with two Hebrew alphabets. The word alphabet comes from the first two letters of the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph and Beyt. So very often people refer to the Hebrew alphabet as the Aleph-Beyt. In the previous lesson, we looked at the 22 letters. And as we go along, I will provide you with more insight into the letters, especially when we get to the second script, the Assyrian script, which is the one used to translate the Bible today. There is a lot more coming into play. But first, we will look at the rudimentary connection between the pictographic script and the Assyrian script. And that rudimentary connection is they share the same word and they share the same meaning. Very important. Once we get to the Babylonian script, we will find that you get things like hard and soft pronunciations. For example, the word Beyt has a form called Beyt and Vayd in the Assyrian script, depending on where in the word it occurs. And there's a lot of rules. There are end forms, which is called suffix forms, which you don't find in the pictographic script. So for now, let's take it step by step. We're going to look at each of the letters. We're going to start with Aleph, we're going to finish with Tav, and just look at some of the gems, some of the insight that we can learn just by looking at the alphabet. I'm going to keep my iPad ready and handy. And we're looking at a chart here by Mr. Jeff Benner. From the left, it has the early, middle, and late Semitic scripts, or the Phoenician script as it's very often called. We're going to focus on the early one because that's the furthest it dates back, and it gives us a little bit of insight into the pictures and therefore almost the ideology of the ancient nomadic people. And then when you go to the right, a little bit later, that you have the early, the middle, the late one resembles a lot to what we see in modern Hebrew. For example, the letter Aleph in the late Semitic script is very similar to the letter Aleph in the modern Hebrew script. Let's quickly go down the 22 letters right to the left under the early column. At the top we have an Aleph, it's the picture of an ox. Then the Beyt, as you can see, is a picture of a tent floor. The little opening at the top resembled the entrance where the men very often would gather according to tradition, and then the little circle is where the protection, the household would actually gather. That's where very often the women and the children would be. So that was kind of how the Beyt represented the house. Then you have the Gemel, which is a foot. And obviously you can understand that for nomadic people who walked a lot, who traveled a lot, the foot is a very important symbol. Then interesting, the fourth letter is a dalet, a door. We will talk a lot about the dalet, but for now, that little picture is like almost a tent flap, an opening dangling that allows you in and out. Next up, very interesting, is the hay. And you can see a little person with his hands in the air. The hay literally resembles, look, behold. It's a person pointing to something. Next up we've got the Vav. The sixth letter is a tent peg. Wow. A language that has a tent peg as part of its alphabet. Very interesting. In Hebraic understanding, the Vav means to connect, to bind, to put things together. And we'll see once it gets into the language how interesting that is. Next up is the Zayin. Now the Zayin is the Hebrew word for utensil, a mattock. And that little implement is probably something from the ancient world that they used to work the ground or do whatever. Next up, it looks like a little ladder that represents a fence, a barrier. It's called the chet. Next up is the tate, which is a basket, almost a top view of a basket. Next up is the yad. Now that one, you'll see interesting, both the yod and the kaf, they follow each other. Both the yod and the kaf resembles the hand, but interestingly, the yod is about a hand that does service, whereas the kaf is an open palm of a hand, like that. It's almost pushing, almost resembling resistance. Next up we have the Lamit. The Lamit is a shepherd's staff, and that represented everything that we connect to the shepherd. Whenever you see a Lamit, it means movement, it means going forward, but it also means everything about protection, looking after your flock. Again, central to the ancient worldview. Next up, very interesting, the Mem. That is the symbol for water, but also for chaos. Think of this. The ancient Hebrews were desert-dwelling people. Water for them was a scary concept. Think of them coming to the shore of an ocean and the waves rumbling onto the beach. Remember, they're not swimmers, they're not oceanfarers, they're not Phoenicians, to be fair. They are people of the desert. So water actually resembled chaos to the Hebrew people. Not because water is chaotic, but for them it was chaotic. And you can almost see that with the way that they drew the Mem. Next up is the Nun. And the Nun, you can see, is a little seed. It means to continue. It means to progress. Literally, something that a desert-dwelling people understood. Next one is Samech. It's a thorn. Now, some people call that a sin, but the actual word for that is Samech. It contains the emotion of hatred, actually. Very interesting. We'll get round to the use of that. Following the Samech, we have the Ayin. And here again, the picture is a circle with a dot. It resembles a physical eye, but it also resembles a spring where water bubbles out of the ground. Okay, following the Ayin, you see, very interesting, there's a letter that the scholars identify which never made it into modern Hebrew, the letter Ga. And for all practical purposes, since the scriptures are written with the modern Hebrew script, we will put the letter Ga on ice. It remains a mystery for now. Next up is the letter Pei, and whatever the little sign was, it resembles a mouth, and it means an opening, an edge. And you can see the difference between the mouth shape of the pictures and the Pei in the modern script. Next up is the Tsari. Now the Tsari, if you look at the picture, looks like a little path, and then it comes to a split in the road and you have a choice. So Tsari literally means not only trail, but it means a split in the trail. There are times when we get to a proverbial split in the road and we have to make a decision, right? We have to decide, do we go left or right? And the determining factor for that decision is based on so many things. It's based on your ideology. It's based on your theology. It's based on what you've been taught. Next up is the Kuf. Now, Kuf is very interesting. Difficult to see it from the picture, but Kuf literally means two things. It means where the light gathers, and therefore often the Kuf resembles the horizon. The modern understanding of Kuf is a gathering of whatever, a gathering of people. Next up is Resh. Resh resembles the head of a man. You can see that's almost an Arabic or a Middle Eastern figure with a turban around the head. And then the last two, Shin, also pronounced as Sin. We'll get round to that when we look at the modern script. And you can see the little round edgedness resembles teeth, your front teeth. And it literally means to bite off or to cut off. And then the final one of the 22 letters is the Taf. Interestingly, the sign of a cross. Now, I don't think that cross has got anything to do with the Christian faith, but it is curious. And then the Taf in the modern one looks like that. So we take it from the top. Aleph-Beyt, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamet, Mem, Nun, Samech, Ayin, Pei, Tsari, Kuf, Resh, Shin or Sin, and then Taf.